if there's one thing that's been constant about Trump, he's been anti-war for a long time. Didn't he buy like a 2-page center, ad on USA Today or New York Times it was to talk about Bush's war?
Oh, hell no!
I happened to hear Hillary Clinton say that I was not against the war in Iraq. I was totally against the war in Iraq.
Are you for invading Iraq?
Yeah, I guess so. I wish it was. I wish the first time it was done correctly. It looks like a tremendous success from a military standpoint.
The only difference between a Democrat and a Republican, as Ralph Nader said, is the speed at which their knee hits the floor when a donor walks in the room.
When you see that?
Well, it's obvious that they don't want you to know the real history. They don't want you to know that when Germany was allowed to reunify, the promise from NATO to Russia was that we won't expand NATO. And then, of course, it did. I think there's 13 or something more countries that they put into NATO.
The nice thing is we can go to archives. We don't have to argue over facts. And in fact, it was a statement made to Gorbachev to say, what about if we did this to try and get NATO, the Warsaw Pact out of East Germany in particular. It was not a promise that was made. And in fact, we even have Gorbachev on the record saying that that's correct. They did not make a promise to me of that. It was an analogy. Gorbachev himself saying no promise was made. And this is just something that has been internalized into the press and the media because of Putin repeating it again and again, which is what propagandists do, right? Forgetting, of course, that his predecessor signed the 1994 Budapest Memorandum of respecting Ukrainian sovereignty.
People don't want you to know that this NATO is not a defensive, it is offensive. This is a war that was started and provoked by NATO and the West.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
I'm sorry, I have to bring this whole discussion somehow back to reality because, David and Paul are talking about, the poor Russians being just goaded into all of this by these terrible things that happened in Ukraine. And the big part that everybody's skipping. First, let me just say that I think David's comparison of January 6th to Maidan is atrocious. I mean, it is, a 240-year-old consolidated democracy as opposed to a country that is still trying to consolidate a democracy against a pro-Russian stooge in their presidential palace who's specifically trying on his own, against the wishes, including of people in his own parliament, to join the European Union, which actually scares Putin more than NATO. I'll agree with Paul about one thing. NATO should never have said, okay, Georgia and Ukraine, it's going to happen. It'll happen down the line. The Russians have been dining out on that statement for 12 years. But we're talking about all of this as though these internal Ukrainian problems are somehow a reason to seize territory from a sovereign state. It's insane. David has said, well, we're not justifying it. I'm sorry, gentlemen, you are both justifying it. You're talking about the war in 2014 breaking out as though it were some sort of force of nature, as opposed to a tantrum from Vladimir Putin, who seized areas full of people that were going to be sympathetic to his views, de facto partitioning the country, and then saying to the Ukrainians, I will hold you responsible for protecting your own country and your own sovereignty. This would be like saying, to take David's completely inappropriate January 6th example, that would be like the Russians saying, well, there's trouble in Washington, so therefore we have the right to seize Texas. I mean, this is crazy.
Zelensky ran on peace. He ran on bringing the country back together, right? The Russian speakers in the East, the Donbass, but he didn't do it. So why? Because he got threatened by NATO and the ultra-right, the Nazis in Ukraine. And when they had a peace deal in March, and that's when Boris Johnson from the UK flew there and said, hey, you don't do this. And he killed the peace deal. So Russia is the one that wants peace in this deal, and Ukraine and NATO do not.
You're so dumb. You are really dumb. For real.
What's missing from all of this is that these are real countries with real cultures run by real people. One of the things that's been missing, for example, both from Steve Walt's comment and from this discussion, is the really malign influence here that nationalist Orthodox church leaders have been playing in advising Putin here and basically convincing him, as Catherine's been pointing out, that he is going to be the great Russian leader that will reunite Orthodoxy. And it's been something that's been driving Putin that realists like Walt and others don't want to talk about, because they don't think culture matters. They don't think history matters. They think what matters is big powers jostling for advantage. Of course it's true. And only a fool would say that Russia could be indifferent to Ukraine and its security situation. But to somehow go from that to, and that's how you get Russia leveling apartment blocks and schools and nursing homes, is ridiculous. It's a way of talking about this in a very clinical, detached way, as though Vladimir Putin isn't a real person who is doing these things for his own reasons. This is not a war that's popular, as far as we can tell, in Russia. This was a war that was launched initially by Putin talking about rescuing his brothers and sisters. I wanted to go back to one point Catherine, I think, was trying to make, that these geopolitical arguments, if these were such strong arguments, Putin wouldn't be talking about Nazis. I mean, this is paranoid. This is paranoid, delusional talk, and we have to deal with the fact that this is what happens when you have power invested in one dictatorial leader who is, in fact, Steve Walt's wrong. Putin is, in fact, nostalgic for the old Soviet Empire and has said so, and he intends to recover those lands.
People don't realize that NATO has provoked this. In fact, there was a peace agreement in 2014. The CIA helped overthrow the Ukraine government.
Are you serious right now, bro?
To say that the U.S. or the West sponsored the Maidan Revolution of 2014. Well, of course, that's nonsense. And I just want to reiterate what Tom said there. You know, this perspective that we somehow have provoked Russia is absurd. It gives no agency to the Ukrainians themselves. And this is Mr. Putin's paranoid global view. And it is a view of the 19th century where great powers struggle against one another and the little peoples in between have no independent agency. And so hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets to protest a corrupt, incompetent government, as they did in Ukraine beginning in the fall of 2013 and 2014, cannot possibly be genuine or spontaneous. It must be managed by other great powers. And this is, of course, ridiculous. That's not the case. It's an insult to the Ukrainians who got out on the street, and about 100 or so who were frankly shot dead on the advice of the Russian security services and a president backed by Russia, and who now lives in Russia. So there's nothing that the U.S. did then or in 2004 to encourage color revolutions. That's absurd.
And then the people in the Donbass didn't want to go along with this coup government, right? Because the leader of Ukraine wanted to be friendlier economically with Russia instead of join like the European Union. And that they couldn't have that, right? So that's why they did a coup. And the people, the Russian speakers in the Donbass didn't want to go along with that coup.
Oh, hell no!
Turning what provoked Maidan in 2014 was the then president Yanukovych not wanting to sign an accession agreement to the European Union, not NATO, the European Union. That's an economic bloc. It's not a military bloc. And so the issue here is one of ideology. Notice, however, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, was not about to be a member of NATO, and that's the same with Georgia too. And the last thing I'll point out is that in terms of sovereignty and security being respected, one thing that's completely left out by the realists in this narrative is that in 2004, in 1994, Boris Yeltsin, Mr. Putin's predecessor as Russian president, signed a Budapest memorandum guaranteeing Ukraine's sovereignty in exchange for the legacy nuclear weapons left there upon the Soviet collapse. And that's the only agreement that has been violated here.
And so people don't know this is what happened. Mm-hmm. And so they just think that one day Putin woke up and said, I want to go invade Ukraine because I'm a maniac. And they think that he's the bad guy. They think that he's acting rationally. He's acting, we always knew he would do this. In fact, we were counting on him doing this. That's why we did what we did.
You stupid, ignorant son of a bitch, dumb bastard! Jesus Christ, I've met some dumb bastards in my time, but you outdo them all.
Putin has been attacking his neighbors since 2008 in Georgia, 2014 in Crimea. The idea that NATO somehow provoked this is just silly. If anything, the North Atlantic Alliance has been going out of its way to try to not to antagonize Putin over the years. What's really bothering him is 40 million Ukrainians trying to practice democracy right on his doorstep. He didn't like it in 2014. He doesn't like it now. My initial inclination in the 1990s, I was a go slow on NATO expansion advocate. I did not want to have a particularly rapid expansion of NATO because I think the Western nations needed to have a deliberate debate about admitting countries. The person who really talked me out of that and who really convinced me that NATO expansion was absolutely necessary was Vladimir Putin. And when we talk about this paranoid atmosphere in Moscow, that's not the creation of the West. That's the creation of a man who is dedicated to holding on to power at all costs, of a paranoid mafia boss who governs as a dictator, keeps his inner circle off balance with each other, surprised his own people with this absolutely insane invasion of Ukraine, including some of his own military and security people, some of whom he now has under house arrest because they couldn't figure out how to do this. The notion that somehow we've been provoking Russia over the years when in fact we reached out with the NATO-Russia Founding Act, with including Russia in the G8, with treating Russia as a peer power, trying to be respectful of their concerns. But that doesn't work when you're dealing with essentially a mafia don who has decided that he must stay in power at all costs. And part of the way he does that is by constantly sparking wars on his borders.
And the Russian would rather have a peace agreement. The rest of the world would rather have a peace agreement. Not NATO, not Joe Biden, not the military-industrial complex. And so that's where we are.
That's the best stupid thing I've ever heard this week, man.
MTS Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is once again calling for talks with his Russian counterpart to end the war. Where do peace negotiations stand? Have we seen any headway?
There was a lot of hope, Nikki, when just even a week ago, President Zelensky had said that progress had been made. We even heard from the Russians saying that things were moving in a very good direction, and then it all just kind of dropped off. And then around 24 hours ago, we had President Zelensky saying, Mr. Putin, it is now the time that we meet face to face, saying that he will meet under any circumstances with the Russian president. But the Kremlin saying, no chance, not going to happen.